The rusted pickup truck shuddered to a stop at the edge of the withered cornfield, its engine coughing before falling silent. Thomas Miller wiped the sweat from his brow and stared at the foreclosure notice crumpled in his hand. His family farm of 3 generations was 90 days from becoming another corporate acquisition. In the distance, a golden retriever limped across his property, dragging a leash behind it. Thomas had no idea that helping this injured animal would lead him to a woman living out of her luxury car, a woman whose designer boots were caked with mud, but whose bank account could buy his entire county. A woman who'd been watching him for weeks, searching for someone genuine in a world of pretenders. Before we carry on, let me know where you are watching from in the comments, and hit the subscribe button for something special tomorrow. The morning sun cast long shadows across Thomas Miller's farmland as he surveyed what remained of his family legacy. At 42, the lines etching his weathered face told stories of drought seasons, market crashes, and the persistent struggle that had become his daily existence. His grandfather had purchased these 200 acres in the 1940s with nothing but determination and calloused hands. His father had expanded it to nearly 500 acres during the agricultural boom of the 1970s. Now, under Thomas's stewardship, the Miller family farm was down to its last 150 acres and drowning in debt. The bank had been more patient than most would be, but the third missed payment had triggered the formal foreclosure process. Thomas had 90 days to come up with nearly $175,000, or the land that had been in his family for generations would be auctioned to the highest bidder. Most likely that would be AgriCorp, the massive industrial farming company that had been systematically acquiring failing family farms throughout the county. Thomas folded the notice and stuffed it into the pocket of his worn jeans. No sense dwelling on what couldn't be changed. He had chores to finish, animals to feed, and a tractor that needed repairs he couldn't afford. Life went on, even when it was crumbling around him. As he turned to head toward the barn, a flash of movement caught his eye. Something golden was moving awkwardly along the tree line that separated his property from the county road. At first, he thought it might be a coyote, but as he squinted against the morning glare, he realized it was a golden retriever. From the looks of it, it appeared to be limping. Thomas whistled sharply, and the dog's head jerked up, its ears perking with interest. It hesitated, then began making its way toward him, its gait uneven and labored. As it got closer, Thomas could see that it was dragging a leash behind it, and one of its front paws was bleeding slightly. "Hey there, buddy," Thomas said softly as the dog approached, its tail wagging cautiously. "What happened to you? Where's your owner?" The dog whined and sat down heavily at Thomas's feet, looking up with soulful brown eyes that seemed to convey both pain and relief at finding human help. Thomas knelt down and gently examined the injured paw. It wasn't serious, just a cut that had collected dirt and debris, but it needed cleaning. "Come on," he said, standing and patting his thigh. "Let's get you fixed up." The dog followed him to the farmhouse, a modest 2-story structure that had seen better days. The white paint was peeling in places, and one of the shutters hung at an angle, a repair project Thomas had been postponing for months. Inside, the house was clean but sparse, with furniture that had belonged to his parents and grandparents. Nothing new had been added in years. There simply wasn't money for such luxuries. In the kitchen, Thomas filled a bowl with clean water and found an old towel. He sat on the floor and coaxed the dog to him, speaking in low, soothing tones as he cleaned the wound. The retriever was well-groomed and healthy-looking, apart from the injured paw, wearing a blue collar with tags that jingled as Thomas worked. After the paw was clean, Thomas checked the tags. The dog's name was Einstein, and there was a phone number, but no address. Thomas frowned. His cell phone service was spotty at best out here, and his landline had been disconnected months ago when he'd had to cut expenses. "Well, Einstein," Thomas said, scratching behind the dog's ears, "looks like you're stuck with me until we can find your owner. You hungry?" Einstein's enthusiastic tail wagging answered that question. Thomas rummaged through his nearly empty refrigerator and found some leftover roast beef from 2 nights ago. He put it in a bowl and set it on the floor, watching as the dog devoured it gratefully. While Einstein ate, Thomas examined the leash. It was high-quality leather with a sturdy metal clasp knot, the kind of leash you'd find at a discount store. Whoever owned this dog had money to spare for the finer things, even for their pets. After finishing the food, Einstein limped over to the back door and whined, clearly needing to go outside. Thomas led him out into the fenced backyard and watched as the dog sniffed around, then took care of business before lying down in a patch of shade near the old oak tree. Thomas needed to get back to his chores, but he couldn't leave the dog here alone. He didn't have a working phone to call the number on the tag, and he couldn't just let Einstein wander off again in his condition. With a sigh, Thomas decided he'd have to drive into town to use the phone at Miller's General Store. No relation, despite sharing his surname, which was run by Betty Miller, a spry octogenarian who insisted they must be cousins, somewhere down the line. Einstein, come on, boy. Thomas called, and the dog perked up immediately, limping over to him. We're going for a ride. The drive into Mapleton took nearly 20 minutes along winding country roads. Einstein sat in the passenger seat, his head out the window, ears flapping in the wind. Despite his own troubles, Thomas found himself smiling at the dog's simple joy. Mapleton was a small town that had seen better days. The main street consisted of a handful of storefronts, half of them empty now that the big box stores had opened up in the neighboring city of Bradford, about 30 miles away. Miller's General Store was one of the few businesses still hanging on, largely because Betty refused to retire and had enough loyal customers to keep the doors open. Thomas parked his truck in front of the store and helped Einstein down from the cab. Together, they walked into the cool interior of the shop, the bell above the door announcing their arrival. Thomas Miller, Betty called from behind the counter. Don't tell me you've gone and got yourself a dog now. Can't hardly feed yourself, and you're taking in strays? Found him wandering on my property this morning, Thomas explained, approaching the counter. He's got a hurt paw and a tag with a phone number. My phone's not working. Mind if I use yours to call his owner? Betty's expression softened. For all her bluster, she had a heart of gold. Of course not. Poor thing looks like he's had quite the adventure. She reached down to pet Einstein, who responded with an appreciative lick to her hand. Phone's in the back office. You know the way. Thomas nodded his thanks and headed to the small office behind the store, Einstein limping along beside him. The office was cluttered but organized in Betty's unique way stacks of invoices, catalogs, and newspapers covering every surface, but somehow never spilling over. He dialed the number from Einstein's tag and waited as it rang. After 4 rings, a woman's voice answered, sounding breathless and worried. Hello? Who is this? My name is Thomas Miller, he said. I found your dog on my property this morning, Einstein, according to his tag. There was a gasp, then a rush of words. Oh my God, thank you. I've been looking everywhere for him. He got spooked by a thunderstorm last night and ran off before I could catch him. Is he okay? He's got a small cut on his paw, but otherwise he seems fine, Thomas assured her. I cleaned up the cut. It's not deep. Thank you so much, the woman said, relief evident in her voice. I can come get him right away. Where are you? Thomas gave her directions to Miller's General Store in Mapleton, explaining that he'd wait there for her. The woman who introduced herself simply as Sarah said. She'd be there within the hour. After hanging up, Thomas returned to the main part of the store, where Betty was organizing a display of canned goods. Owner's on her way, he told her. Mind if we wait here? Not at all, Betty said. But make yourself useful while you're waiting. Those bags of flour need stacking on the bottom shelf over there. Thomas chuckled and got to work, with Einstein settling on the floor nearby, watching him with curious eyes. As he stacked the flour bags, Thomas found himself wondering about the dog's owner. The quality of Einstein's collar and leash suggested money, and the woman had said she could come right away, meaning she either wasn't working on a Tuesday morning or had the kind of job that allowed her to drop everything in a blah. Moment's notice. It was none of his business, of course. He'd return the dog, and that would be that back to figuring out how to save his farm from foreclosure, a problem that seemed more impossible with each passing day. About 45 minutes later, the bell above the door jingled, and a woman walked in. Thomas glanced up from where he was now helping Betty price items and felt a momentary surprise. The woman, Sarah, he presumed was not what he had expected. She was in her late 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans with dirt stains on the knees, a plain gray t-shirt, and a flannel shirt tied around her waist. Her hiking boots were well worn and muddy. If Thomas had passed her on the street, he might have mistaken her for a fellow farmer or perhaps a landscaper. The moment Einstein saw her, he let out a joyful bark and bounded toward her as best he could with his injured paw, his entire body wiggling with excitement. "Einstein!" she cried, dropping to her knees to embrace the dog, who was frantically licking her face. "Oh, I was so worried about you." Thomas approached slowly, not wanting to intrude on the reunion. When Sarah finally looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of relief, he was struck by how vibrantly green they were against her lightly freckled face. "You must be Thomas," she said, rising to her feet and extending her hand. "Thank you so much for taking care of him." "Just did what anyone would do," Thomas replied, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm, her palm slightly calloused, not the soft hand he'd expected based on Einstein's expensive accessories. "Not everyone would take the time to clean his wound and bring him to town to call me," Sarah countered with a warm smile. "I really appreciate it." There was something about her smile that seemed familiar to Thomas, though he was certain they'd never met. Perhaps she just had one of those faces that reminded you of someone else. "Your dog has expensive taste in collars and leashes," Betty commented from behind the counter, never one to miss an opportunity to join a conversation. Sarah laughed, a light, genuine sound. "The collar was a gift from my brother. He thinks Einstein deserves only the best." "Well, your brother's got good taste," Betty said approvingly. "Look, I'd really like to thank you properly," Sarah said, turning back to Thomas. "Could I buy you lunch or something? There must be a diner in town." Thomas hesitated. He had a long list of chores waiting for him back at the farm, and time spent not working was time wasted when the clock was ticking on his foreclosure. But there was something in Sarah's expression and earnestness that was hard to refuse. "Maggie's Diner is just down the street," he said finally. "Best meatloaf in the county on Tuesdays." "Perfect," Sarah said, her smile widening. "Lead the way." As they left the store, Betty called after them, "You two kids have fun now," causing Thomas to shake his head in mild embarrassment. Betty had been trying to set him up with every available woman in a 50-mile radius since his divorce 5 years ago. They walked down Main Street toward Maggie's Diner, Einstein trotting happily between them despite his injury. Thomas noticed that Sarah took in the small town with interest, her eyes lingering on the empty storefronts with what seemed like genuine concern, rather than the dismissive glance most visitors gave them. "Small towns are having a tough time these days," she commented. "Yeah," Thomas agreed. "Between the drought 3 years ago and the big box stores opening in Bradford, a lot of businesses couldn't hang on. The younger folks are moving away for better opportunities." "But you stayed," Sarah observed, glancing at Brad. Him with curiosity, Thomas shrugged. "Family farm. Been in the Miller name for 3 generations. Hard to walk away from that." He didn't mention the foreclosure notice burning a hole in his pocket. No sense burdening a stranger with his problems. Maggie's Diner was a classic small-town establishment with chrome-edged tables, vinyl booths, and a counter with spinning stools. The lunch rush had just begun, and the place was about half full, mostly locals who nodded to Thomas as they entered. More than a few curious glances were cast in Sarah's direction. Newcomers were always a subject of interest in Mapleton. Maggie herself, a sturdy woman in her 60s with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a tight bun, approached their table as they settled into a booth by the window. Einstein curled up at Sarah's feet under the table. "Thomas Miller, twice in 1 month. Must be a special occasion," Maggie teased, then turned her appraising gaze to Sarah. "And you've brought a friend." "This is Sarah," Thomas said, realizing he didn't know her last name. "She's Einstein's owner, the dog I found this morning." "Well, any friend of Thomas's is a friend of mine," Maggie said warmly, handing them menus. "Tuesday's meatloaf special is already going fast. I hear it's the best in the county," Sarah said with a smile. "You heard right," Maggie confirmed proudly. "Can I get you folks something to drink while you decide?" They both ordered iced tea, and Maggie promised to return shortly with their drinks. "So," Sarah said once Maggie had left, "tell me about your farm. What do you grow?" Thomas was surprised by her interest but found himself answering, "It's a mixed operation. About 70 acres of corn, 50 of soybeans, and the rest is pasture for a small herd of cattle, just 20 head now. Used to be more, but—" He trailed off, not wanting to dive into his financial woes. "That sounds like a lot of work for one person," Sarah commented. "It is," Thomas admitted. "I have a part-time helper, Lewis, who comes by 3 days a week. Good worker. Wish I could afford to hire him full-time, but—" Again, he caught himself before revealing too much. Sarah seemed to sense his discomfort and changed the subject. "Einstein and I haven't been in the area long. We're just passing through, actually. I'm on a bit of a road trip." "Where are you staying?" Thomas asked, then immediately worried the question might seem too personal. But Sarah answered easily. "I've been camping here and there. I have a pretty comfortable setup in my car." Thomas raised his eyebrows in surprise. Living out of her car wasn't what he'd expected based on Einstein's high-end accessories. Before he could ask more, Maggie returned with their drinks and took their food orders meatloaf special for both of them. As they waited for their food, Sarah asked more questions about the area, the drought they'd experienced, and the challenges of small-scale farming in today's economy. Thomas found himself opening up more than he usually did with strangers. There was something about Sarah that put him at ease, a genuine interest in what he was saying, combined with an understanding of agricultural issues that suggested she wasn't just making small talk. Their food arrived, and conversation slowed as they enjoyed Maggie's famous meatloaf. It wasn't until they were nearly finished that Sarah said, "I noticed your truck was making a strange noise when you pulled up to the general store. Sounded like it might be a timing belt issue." Thomas looked at her in surprise. "You know about engines?" Sarah smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "I know a few things about a few things. Mind if I take a look after lunch? It's the least I can do to thank you for rescuing Einstein." "I don't know," Thomas said hesitantly. "It's been making that noise for weeks. I've been meaning to take it into Bradford to the mechanic there, but—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what he meant. He couldn't afford it. "Let me just take a look," Sarah insisted. No obligation. After lunch, which Sarah insisted on paying for despite Thomas's protests, they returned to his truck parked in front of Miller's General Store. Sarah rolled up her sleeves and had Thomas pop the hood. To his astonishment, she leaned in confidently, inspecting various components with a practiced eye. "When was the last time you changed the serpentine belt?" she asked, pointing to a clearly worn belt. "Not since I got the truck 5 years ago," Thomas admitted. Sarah nodded, continuing her inspection. "Your timing belt looks okay for now, but this serpentine belt is on its last legs. If it snaps, you'll be stranded. And your air filter is filthy." She glanced up at him. "Got any tools in the truck?" Thomas nodded, bewildered by this turn of events, and retrieved his toolbox from behind the seat. For the next 30 minutes, he watched in amazement as Sarah replaced his serpentine belt with a spare she found in his toolbox, left there by the previous owner and forgotten, and cleaned out his air filter as best she could, without a replacement. "That should hold you for a while," she said, wiping her hands on a rag. "But you should really get a new air filter soon. You'll get better gas mileage." "Where did you learn to do all this?" Thomas asked, unable to hide his curiosity any longer. Sarah smiled enigmatically. "My father believed everyone should know how to maintain their own vehicles. He was very practical that way." Before Thomas could ask more questions, Sarah's phone rang. She pulled it from her pocket, glanced at the screen, and frowned slightly. "Excuse me, I need to take this," she said, stepping away for privacy. Thomas busied himself with putting his tools away, but he couldn't help overhearing snippets of Sarah's conversation. Her tone had shifted, becoming more clipped and professional. "I told you I needed time." "No, that's not acceptable. The terms were clear, Richard. I don't care what the board thinks. 2 more weeks, that's all." "Fine. Have the papers ready. But I won't sign anything until I'm ready." When she returned, her expression was carefully neutral, but Thomas could sense a tension that hadn't been there before. "Everything okay?" he asked. Just business, she said dismissively. Nothing that can't wait a little longer. She looked at Einstein, who was sniffing around a nearby fire hydrant. We should probably get going. I've taken up enough of your time. Thomas found himself reluctant to see her leave, which was surprising. He barely knew this woman, yet there was something about her that intrigued him, her self-sufficiency, her knowledge, the mystery of why someone who clearly had some education and skills was living out of her car with an expensive dog. Where are you headed next? He asked. Sarah hesitated, seeming to make a decision. Actually, I'm not sure. I was planning to stay in the area for a few days, explore a bit. An idea formed in Thomas's mind before he could fully think it through. If you need a place to park and camp, my farm has plenty of space. Safer than a public campground or the side of the road. As soon as the words left his mouth, he wondered if he'd overstepped. Inviting a stranger to stay on his property wasn't something he'd normally do. But Sarah's face lit up. Really? That would be wonderful, if you're sure it's not an imposition. Not at all, Thomas said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. I've got a water hookup you can use, and there's a spot near the old barn that's level and sheltered. That's incredibly kind of you, Sarah said, her green eyes warm with gratitude. And in return, maybe I could help out around the farm? I'm pretty good with my hands, as you've seen. Thomas started to protest that it wasn't necessary, but the truth was, he could use the help. His pride warred briefly with practicality before he nodded. I wouldn't say no to an extra pair of hands, but only if you want to. It's settled then, Sarah said with a decisive nod. Lead the way to Miller Farm, and Einstein and I will follow in my car. Sarah's car turned out to be a 3-year-old Subaru Outback with a roof rack and what appeared to be a decent camping setup in the back. It wasn't the luxury vehicle Thomas might have expected based on Einstein's accessories, but it was certainly newer and in better shape than his aging truck. As they drove the winding roads back to his farm, Thomas found himself glancing in his rearview mirror more often than necessary, half expecting Sarah's Subaru to turn around or veer off in another direction, but she followed steadily behind him, Einstein's head occasionally visible in the passenger window. Thomas couldn't quite explain the mixture of emotions he was feeling. Caution. Certainly he wasn't naive enough to ignore the potential risks of inviting a stranger to stay on his property. But there was also an unexpected lightness. A break in the cloud of worry that had been his constant companion since receiving the foreclosure notice. When they arrived at the farm, Thomas led Sarah to a level spot near the old barn, which was now used primarily for storage rather than livestock. The location offered some shelter from the wind and was close enough to the house to access the water spigot, but far enough away to provide privacy. This is perfect, Sarah said, appreciatively, as she surveyed the spot. Great view of the sunset too, I imagine. One of the best on the property, Thomas confirmed. Bathroom's a bit of an issue though. I can leave the back door unlocked if you need to use the facilities in the house. I've got a portable camping toilet in the car, Sarah assured him, and I'm used to taking quick showers with minimal water. I'll be fine. As Sarah began setting up her campsite, Thomas was impressed by the efficiency of her system. Within 30 minutes, she had erected a small but sturdy tent next to her car, set up a compact camping table and chair, and arranged a basic cooking station with a portable propane stove. You've done this before, he commented. Sarah smiled as she unrolled a sleeping pad inside the tent. I've been on the road for about 3 weeks now. You learn quickly what works and what doesn't. 3 weeks living out of your car, Thomas mused. Most people would have had enough after 3 days. I'm not most people, Sarah replied with a small shrug. And it's been educational. You see a different side of the world this way. There was something in her tone, a hint of something deeper than casual road trip exploration. But Thomas didn't press. Everyone had their reasons for the choices they made, and Sarah's were none of his business. Well, I'll let you get settled, he said. I've got chores to finish before sundown. If you're serious about helping out, I could use a hand feeding the cattle tomorrow morning. They're in the east pasture. I'll be ready, Sarah promised. What time? I usually start around 5:30 a.m. Sarah didn't even blink at the early hour. 5:30 it is. Thomas nodded and headed toward his tractor, which was parked near the equipment shed. As he worked through his afternoon chores checking irrigation lines, repairing a section of fence, and clearing a clogged drainage ditch, he found his thoughts repeatedly returning to Sarah. Who was she really? What was her story, and why did he feel like he'd seen her somewhere before? The next morning, Thomas stepped out onto his porch at 5:25 a.m. with a thermos of coffee, fully expecting to have to wake Sarah. To his surprise, she was already up, dressed in work clothes similar to yesterday's outfit, her hair tied back under a cap. Einstein sat obediently at her side, his tail sweeping the ground when he spotted Thomas. "Morning," Sarah called cheerfully. "Hope you've got enough coffee to share." Thomas held up the thermos and another mug he brought just in case. Plenty to go around. They walked together to the equipment shed, where Thomas kept the feed for the cattle. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, promising another clear, hot day. As they worked side by side, loading bags of feed onto the back of Thomas's ATV, he was struck again by how capable Sarah was. She lifted the 50-pound bags with proper technique, clearly no stranger to physical labor. "So where are you from originally?" Thomas asked as they rode the ATV toward the east pasture, Einstein running alongside them. "Connecticut," Sarah replied after a brief hesitation. "Small town you've probably never heard of." "What brought you on this road trip?" Sarah was quiet for a moment before answering. "Needed a change of perspective. Wanted to see how people in other parts of the country live. The real America, I guess you could say." "And what have you found so far?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. "That people are basically the same everywhere, just trying to make a living, take care of their families, find a little happiness where they can," Sarah said thoughtfully. "But the challenges are different depending on where you are. Some places have more opportunities than others." They reached the pasture where Thomas's small herd of cattle was already gathering at the fence, anticipating breakfast. As they distributed the feed, Sarah asked intelligent questions about his operation, questions that revealed she knew more about agriculture than the average person. "You seem to know a lot about farming for someone from Connecticut," Thomas observed. Sarah smiled enigmatically. "I've always been interested in sustainable agriculture. I've done some research over the years." After feeding the cattle, they returned to the house, where Thomas invited Sarah in for a proper breakfast. His kitchen was modest but functional, with appliances that were at least 15 years old but well maintained. "Nothing fancy," he warned as he pulled eggs and bacon from the refrigerator. "But it'll fill you up." "Sounds perfect to me," Sarah said, washing her hands at the sink. "Can I help?" Together, they prepared a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast. As they ate at the small kitchen table, the conversation flowed easily between them. Thomas found himself talking about his failed marriage, how his ex-wife had grown tired of the financial struggles and isolation of farm life and had eventually left for a job in Chicago. Sarah listened without judgment, offering occasional comments that showed she understood the challenges of rural life. When Thomas asked about her own background, Sarah was more reticent, speaking in generalities about growing up in a family with comfortable means and working in the business world before deciding to take her sabbatical. Thomas sensed there was much more to her story, but didn't push. After breakfast, Sarah insisted on helping with the dishes before they headed out for the rest of the morning's chores. As they worked together inspecting the cornfields, Thomas found himself explaining the problems he was facing: the outdated irrigation system that wasted too much water, the rising cost of feed and fertilizer, the declining market prices for his crops. "The real issue is scale," he explained as they walked between rows of corn that should have been taller at this point in the season. "The big operations can afford the latest equipment, get bulk discounts on supplies, and weather a bad year or two. Small farms like mine have no margin for error." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Have you considered diversifying? Maybe adding some specialty crops with higher profit margins?" "I've thought about it," Thomas admitted. "Organic certification would help command premium prices, but the transition period is expensive, and I'd need different equipment. There's just no capital for it." "What about grants or agricultural programs?" Sarah suggested. "There are foundations that specifically support small-scale sustainable farming. Applied for 3 different grants last year, Thomas said with a shrug. Got turned down for all of them. Too many farmers chasing too little money, I guess. They spent the rest of the morning repairing an irrigation pump that had been giving Thomas trouble for weeks. Sarah proved to be surprisingly knowledgeable about mechanics, diagnosing a problem with the impeller that Thomas had overlooked. With her help, they had the pump working more efficiently than it had in months. As the days passed, Sarah continued to help around the farm, quickly becoming familiar with the daily routine. She was a quick learner and seemed genuinely interested in every aspect of the operation. Thomas found himself increasingly comfortable with her presence, looking forward to their conversations over meals or while working side by side. In the evenings, Sarah would retire to her campsite, where she often sat outside reading by lantern light or working on her laptop when she could get a signal on her phone to use as a hotspot. Thomas sometimes joined her, bringing a couple of beers or a bottle of his homemade blackberry wine to share as they talked under the stars. It was during one of these evening conversations, about a week after Sarah's arrival, that Thomas finally asked the question that had been nagging at him. "Why do I feel like I've seen you somewhere before?" Sarah stiffened almost imperceptibly before taking a slow sip of wine. "I have one of those faces, I guess. People say that a lot." But Thomas wasn't satisfied with that answer. "No, it's more specific than that. I've been trying to place it for days." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring into her wineglass. Then she sighed softly. "I should probably go soon. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." "You're not imposing," Thomas said quickly, surprised by how much the thought of her leaving bothered him. "The help you've given me is worth far more than a camping spot." "Still," Sarah said, "I didn't plan to stay in one place this long. This road trip was about seeing different places, meeting different people." "Right," Thomas said, trying to hide his disappointment. "Of course." They fell into silence, the chirp of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle, the only sounds. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice softer. "What would you do, Thomas, if money wasn't an issue? If you could save your farm and make it everything you dream it could be?" Thomas looked up at the stars, considering the question. No one had asked him that in a long time. Everyone in Mapleton knew the situation was hopeless. There was no point in dreaming. "I'd transition to fully organic," he said finally. "Install a modern drip irrigation system to conserve water. Maybe add some high-value crops like herbs or specialty vegetables for farm-to-table. Restaurants. Build a proper processing facility for the beef operation so I could sell directly to consumers instead of to the processors for pennies on the dollar." End quote. He paused, surprised by the flow of ideas that had been bottled up inside him. "I'd hire Lewis full-time, maybe bring on another worker or two from town, create some jobs." Sarah was watching him intently, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. "You've thought about this." "Hard not to," Thomas admitted. "When you're about to lose everything, you think a lot about what you would do differently if you had the chance." Sarah opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. After a moment, she simply nodded and said, "It's a good dream, Thomas, a worthy one." The next morning, Thomas was up early as usual, but when he stepped outside, he was surprised to find Sarah's campsite already packed up. She was loading the last of her gear into the Subaru when she spotted him approaching. "You're leaving," he said, unable to keep the disappointment from his voice. "It's time," Sarah replied, not quite meeting his eyes. "I stayed longer than I planned already." "Was it something I said last night?" Thomas asked, searching her face for clues. Sarah shook her head firmly. "No, not at all. I've loved every minute here, Thomas. But I have responsibilities I can't ignore forever, people depending on me." Thomas nodded slowly, trying to understand. In just a week, he'd grown accustomed to her presence, to having someone to talk to share the burden of work and worry. The farm would feel emptier without her. "Will you at least stay for breakfast?" he asked. Sarah glanced at her watch, then nodded. "I'd like that." Over breakfast, they spoke of lighter things, funny stories from Thomas's childhood on the farm, Sarah's adventures in the 3 weeks of her road trip before arriving in Mapleton. But there was an undercurrent of tension, of things unsaid hanging between them. As they finished their coffee, Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card. sliding it across the table to Thomas. "If you ever need anything, or if you're ever in Hartford, call this number." Thomas looked down at the card. It was plain white with just a phone number printed in black. No name, no company, no email address. "That's it?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. "A mysterious phone number?" Sarah smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "For now. I promise it will make sense eventually." She stood, and Thomas followed her outside to her car. Einstein was already in the passenger seat, watching them through the window with his head tilted. "Thank you for everything, Thomas," Sarah said, extending her hand. "For taking care of Einstein, for your hospitality, for showing me what real farming is about." Thomas took her hand, but instead of shaking it, he held it for a moment longer than necessary. "You're welcome back any time. The campsite will be waiting." Something flickered in Sarah's eyes, regret perhaps, or something deeper. "I might take you up on that Sunday." And then she was gone, the Subaru kicking up dust on the dirt road as it disappeared around the bend. Thomas stood watching until long after the car was out of sight, the mysterious business card clutched in his hand. The farm felt eerily quiet that day. Thomas went through his chores mechanically, his thoughts repeatedly drifting to Sarah. Had she really been there at all? The only evidence was the card in his pocket and the newly repaired irrigation pump that was working better than it had in years. That evening, as Thomas sat alone on his porch, watching the sunset, the same sunset that Sarah had admired from her campsite just the night before, his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number with a Hartford area code. "Hello?" he answered cautiously. "Mr. Miller?" a male voice said. "My name is Richard Prentice. I'm calling on behalf of the Westbrook Foundation. Do you have a moment to talk?" Thomas frowned in confusion. "The Westbrook Foundation? I've never heard of it." "We're a private philanthropic organization focused on sustainable agriculture and rural economic development," the man explained. "Your farm has been nominated for our small farm revitalization grant." "Nominated?" Thomas repeated, bewildered. "By whom?" There was a slight pause before Richard answered. "The nomination came from our founder, but the selection process is confidential at this stage. What matters is that your operation fits our criteria perfectly. We'd like to send a representative to discuss the possibilities with you. The grant could be substantial, potentially up to $200,000. Thomas nearly dropped the phone. $200,000 would more than cover the amount needed to stop the foreclosure, with enough left over to implement some of the improvements he dreamed about. "This isn't some kind of scam, is it?" he asked suspiciously. It seemed too convenient, too perfectly timed. Richard chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "I assure you, Mr. Miller, the Westbrook Foundation is very real. You can look us up. We've been operating for nearly 15 years and have funded agricultural projects across 12 states. The representative can bring all the documentation you need to verify our legitimacy." End quote. Thomas agreed to meet with the foundation's representative the following week. After hanging up, he immediately went to his computer, an ancient desktop that took several minutes to boot up, and searched for information on the Westbrook Foundation. To his surprise, it was indeed a legitimate organization, with a professional website showcasing dozens of farming operations that had received grants over the years. The foundation focused specifically on helping small-scale farmers transition to more sustainable practices while maintaining economic viability. What struck Thomas as odd, however, was that he couldn't find much information about the founder. The website mentioned only that the Westbrook Foundation had been established in 2010 by a private donor with a passion for sustainable agriculture. There were no photos, no names, no personal stories, just the results of the foundation's work. For the next week, Thomas alternated between cautious optimism and paranoid suspicion. Could this really be happening? And why him, of all people? He hadn't applied for this grant. Someone had specifically nominated his farm. The day before the scheduled meeting with the foundation representative, Thomas received another call. "Thomas? It's Betty from the general store. You need to come into town right away." "What's wrong?" Thomas asked, alarmed by the urgency in her voice. "Nothing's wrong," Betty said. "But there's something you need to see. Trust me." You won't believe it unless you see it with your own eyes." Curious and slightly concerned, Thomas drove into Mapleton. When he arrived at Miller's General Store, Betty was waiting for him at the counter, practically buzzing with excitement. "Look at this," she said, thrusting a glossy magazine into his hands. It was the latest issue of Business Impact, a national publication that Thomas had heard of but never read. Betty had it open to a feature article titled, "America's Most Influential Philanthropists Under 40. Third page of the article, Betty instructed, tapping the magazine impatiently. Thomas turned the page and froze. There, smiling at him from a professional photograph, was Sarah, except she wasn't the Sarah he knew. This woman had perfectly styled auburn hair instead of a simple ponytail, wore an elegant black dress instead of dirt-stained jeans, and was identified in the caption as Sarah Westbrook, tech entrepreneur and founder of the Westbrook Foundation. "That's her, isn't it?" Betty demanded. "The woman with the dog? I knew she looked familiar. Been driving me crazy for days trying to place her. Then my niece from Bradford brought me this magazine yesterday, and there she was." Thomas stared at the photograph in disbelief. According to the article, Sarah Westbrook had made her fortune in tech, developing specialized software for agricultural management that she'd sold to a major corporation for nearly $1 billion, 5 years ago. Since then, she dedicated herself to philanthropic work through her foundation, focusing primarily on sustainable agriculture and rural economic development. "Says she's worth over $2 billion, Betty said, her eyes wide. "A billionaire. Right here in my store, and I never knew it." Thomas barely heard her. His mind was racing, connecting dots that suddenly made sense. Sarah's knowledge of farming and mechanics, her pointed questions about his operation, the mysterious phone call about the grant nomination. "I have to go," he said abruptly, handing the magazine back to Betty. "Wait, aren't you going to tell me how you two met? Why was she camping on your property? Are you two—" But Thomas was already out the door, his thoughts too jumbled to deal with Betty's inevitable barrage of questions. Back at the farm, Thomas paced his living room, the business card Sarah had given him now, feeling like it was burning a hole in his pocket. Should he call? What would he say? "I know who you really are?" What did it even mean that a billionaire philanthropist had spent a week camping on his farm, helping with chores, and listening to his dreams for the place? He was still deliberating when his phone rang again. This time, it was the mysterious number from Sarah's card. "Hello, Thomas," Sarah's voice came through, sounding exactly as he remembered it. No pretense, no artifice. "I'm guessing by now you've figured it out." "Betty showed me the magazine," Thomas confirmed, his voice carefully neutral. "Sarah Westbrook, tech entrepreneur and billionaire philanthropist. A bit different from the Sarah who fixed my truck and helped feed my cattle." There was a brief silence before Sarah spoke again. "That Sarah is the real me, Thomas. The one in the magazine, in the boardrooms, at the charity galas, that's the role I play. But the woman who camped on your farm, who worked alongside you, that's who I am when no one's watching." "Why the charade?" Thomas asked, trying to keep the hurt from his voice. "Why not just tell me who you were? Would you have treated me the same if you'd known?" Sarah challenged gently. "Would you have let me help with the chores, shared your homemade wine, talked about your dreams for the farm? Or would you have seen me as a potential investor, a walking checkbook?" Thomas considered this. She had a point. He would have behaved differently, more guardedly, more formally if he'd known who she really was. "The Westbrook Foundation representative coming tomorrow," he said slowly. "That's your doing, isn't it?" "Yes," Sarah admitted. "But the foundation is legitimate, Thomas, and so is the grant. The selection committee reviews all nominations independently, even mine. Your farm qualifies on its own merits. I just made sure they knew about Kai." Thomas sank into his armchair, overcome by conflicting emotions: gratitude for the lifeline being offered, pride that made him want to refuse charity, and underneath it all, a sense of betrayal that the woman he'd begun to care for hadn't been honest with him. "I don't know what to say," he finally managed. "Say you'll meet with the representative tomorrow," Sarah urged. "Listen to what they have to offer. After that, it's entirely your decision whether to accept or not. No strings attached." "And what about you?" Thomas asked, the question that had been foremost in his mind finally emerging. "Was all of this just research for your foundation? A wealthy woman's idea of a rustic adventure?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "Meeting you was pure chance. Einstein really did run away during that storm. And everything that happened after staying at your farm, working with you, that was real, Thomas. More real than anything in my life has been for Akane." Long time. Thomas wanted to believe her, but doubt crept in. "So what now? You go back to your billionaire life, and I go back to trying to save my farm?" "That depends," Sarah said, her voice softening. "The foundation representative will be there tomorrow at 10 a.m. After you've had that meeting. If you want to talk, really talk. No more secrets. Call this number again. I'll answer. I promise. I promise." The next morning, Thomas dressed in his one good shirt and waited on the porch for the foundation representative. At precisely 10 a.m., a sleek black car pulled up in front of his house. A man in his 50s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Thomas made in a month, emerged from the driver's seat. "Mr. Miller? Richard Prentice from the Westbrook Foundation. Thank you for meeting with me." Over the next 2 hours, Richard explained the details of the grant program. It wasn't charity, he emphasized repeatedly. It was an investment in sustainable agriculture. If selected, Thomas would receive up to $200,000 to implement specific improvements to his operation, transitioning to organic certification, installing water-efficient irrigation systems, upgrading processing facilities for direct-to-consumer sales. The foundation would provide technical assistance and mentoring throughout the process. In return, Thomas would document his progress, share data on outcomes, and host occasional educational events for other farmers interested in making similar transitions. "The goal is to create replicable models of sustainable small farm success," Richard explained. "Ms. Westbrook believes that small farms like yours are essential to America's food security and rural communities. She's committed to proving they can be economically viable with the right support and systems in place." By the time Richard left, Thomas's head was spinning with possibilities. The grant wouldn't just save his farm from foreclosure, it could transform it into the operation he'd always dreamed of, but never had the capital to create. And, contrary to his initial suspicions, it wasn't a handout. It was a partnership that would require hard work, dedication, and accountability on his part. As he watched Richard's car disappear down the driveway, Thomas pulled out his phone and the business card Sarah had given him. He hesitated only briefly before dialing the number. Sarah answered on the first ring. "Thomas, the foundation representative just left," he said. "It's an impressive program, but—" Sarah prompted, sensing his reservation. "But I still have questions. For you, not about the grant." There was a pause before Sarah replied. "I'm actually not far away. I could be there in person in about an hour if that would be better." Thomas agreed, and exactly 58 minutes later, the now familiar Subaru appeared on his dirt road. Einstein was once again in the passenger seat, his tail visibly wagging through the window as they approached. Sarah stepped out of the car, looking much as she had during her week at the farm. Jeans, simple t-shirt, hair in a ponytail. The only difference was the tension in her shoulders, the uncertainty in her eyes as she approached Thomas on the porch. Einstein had no such reservations, bounding up to Thomas and nearly knocking him over with his enthusiastic greeting. "He missed you," Sarah said, hanging back. "Just him?" Thomas asked, meeting her gaze directly. A small smile tugged at the corner of Sarah's mouth. "No, not just him." Thomas gestured to the porch swing where they had sat several evenings during her stay. As they settled side by side, Einstein flopping contentedly at their feet, Thomas finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "Why were you really on this road trip, Sarah? What were you looking for?" Sarah took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Authenticity, connection, a reminder of why I started the foundation in the first place." She looked out over the fields, her expression wistful. "Success changes things, Thomas. People treat you differently when they know you have money. They want something from you, or they put you on a pedestal, or they resent you for having what they don't. It gets hard to know who you can trust, who sees you for who you really are, versus what you can do for them. She turned to face him directly. 3 weeks ago, I walked out of a board meeting where my advisors were pressuring me to focus the foundation's resources on larger, more efficient agricultural operations. They had charts and graphs showing how we could maximize impact by working with bigger farms. I tried to explain that wasn't the point, that saving small family farms was the goal, not just increasing overall agricultural output. But they couldn't see it. They've never stood in a field that's been in the same family for generations. They've never felt the connection to the land that I saw in you. So you decided to go find that connection yourself, Thomas said, beginning to understand. Sarah nodded. I told them I needed time to think, packed a bag, grabbed Einstein, and just started driving. I wanted to see the real America, talk to real farmers, remind myself why this work matters so much to me. I never planned to stay anywhere more than a night or two, but then Einstein right away, and I met you, and she trailed off, her eyes meeting his. And it felt right here. Real. Until you got that phone call that day, Thomas remembered. From Richard, I'm guessing? Yes, Sarah confirmed. The board was getting impatient with my absence. There were decisions that needed to be made, documents that required my signature. I bought myself a little more time, but I knew I'd have to go back soon. And I knew that once you found out who I really was, everything would change. You don't know that, Thomas said quietly. Don't I? Sarah challenged gently. Tell me honestly, Thomas, if I'd driven up that first day in a luxury car, introduced myself as Sarah Westbrook of the Westbrook Foundation, and offered to help save your farm, how would you have reacted? Thomas considered this, then sighed. I probably would have been suspicious of your motives, wondered what the catch was, and, yes, I probably would have seen you primarily as a potential financial solution to my problems. And now? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, seeing both the woman who had worked alongside him in the fields and the brilliant entrepreneur who had built a billion-dollar company and dedicated her fortune to helping farmers like him. Now I see someone who genuinely cares about this land, about small farms, about rural communities, he said slowly. Someone who isn't afraid of hard work, who knows the difference between a serpentine belt and a timing belt, who asks smart questions and actually listens to the answers. Someone who understands what this place means to me, because it means something to her too. Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. That's all I wanted to be seen for who I am, not what I have. I see you, Sarah, Thomas said simply. Both versions. And I think they're the same person at heart. The tension in Sarah's shoulders eased visibly. So where do we go from here? Well, Thomas said thoughtfully, I think I'm going to accept that grant from your foundation. Not because it's from you, but because it's a good program that aligns perfectly with my goals for this farm. Sarah smiled. And, Thomas continued, returning her smile, I think I'm going to need some expert advice as I implement all these changes. Someone who understands both the agricultural and business sides of the operation. Know anyone who might be interested in consulting on the project? I might, Sarah said, her smile widening. Though I should warn you, I tend to be very hands-on in my consulting work. Might involve getting my boots dirty. I wouldn't have it any other way, Thomas assured her. As the sun began to set over the cornfields, casting long shadows across the land that had been in Thomas's family for generations, he and Sarah sat side by side on the porch swing, their shoulders touching, Einstein snoring softly at their feet. They talked of plans for the farm, for the foundation, for a future neither of them had anticipated just 2 weeks earlier. And when Thomas finally leaned over and kissed Sarah, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, it wasn't the billionaire philanthropist he was kissing, nor was it the mysterious woman living out of her car. It was simply Sarah, the woman who had seen the value in his dreams when everyone else saw only a failing farm, the woman who understood that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. 6 months later, the Miller family farm was transformed. The foreclosure notice was long gone, replaced by organic certification papers proudly framed in the farmhouse kitchen. The outdated irrigation system had been replaced with a state-of-the-art drip system that reduced water usage by nearly 60%. A new processing facility stood where the old storage barn had been, allowing Thomas to package and sell his beef directly to restaurants and consumers at premium prices. Lewis now worked full-time, along with 2 other locals who had been struggling to find employment in Mapleton. Sarah divided her time between her foundation headquarters in Hartford and the farm, where she had upgraded from a tent to sharing Thomas's renovated farmhouse. Einstein had permanently relocated to the farm, where he had become fast friends with a rescued border collie named Max. The Miller farm had become a showcase for the Westbrook Foundation's approach to small farm revitalization. Farmers from across the state and beyond regularly visited to see the systems in place and learn how they might adapt similar approaches to their own operations. On a crisp autumn evening, as Thomas and Sarah walked the property surveying the newly harvested fields, Sarah paused at the spot where her tent had once stood. "Did you ever imagine, when you found a limping dog on your property that day, that your life would change like this?" she asked, slipping her hand into his. Thomas shook his head, smiling. "Not in a million years. I was just trying to get through each day, keep the bank at bay for another week. I couldn't see beyond the next payment, the next season." He squeezed her hand gently. "You helped me dream again, Sarah. Not just by providing the money, though. That certainly helped, but by believing this place was worth saving, that the work we do here matters." "It does matter," Sarah said firmly. "Every small farm that survives, every rural community that thrives because of IT, all matters. That's why I created the foundation in the first place." They continued their walk, discussing plans for next season's crops, a potential expansion of the cattle herd, and the educational workshops they would host for other farmers in the spring. As the sun began to set, they turned back toward the farmhouse, where warm light spilled from the windows, and smoke curled from the chimney. "You know," Thomas said, as they approached the house, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said when we first met, about how people are basically the same everywhere, just trying to make a living, take care of their families, find a little happiness where they can." Sarah nodded, remembering. "It's true. It is," Thomas agreed. "But I think there's more to it than that. Some people are just trying to get by, going through the motions of living without really engaging with the world around them. And others, people like you, are actively trying to make things better, not just for themselves, but for everyone they touch." And Sarah leaned into him, touched by his words. "I could say the same about you, you know. You could have given up on this place, walked away, found an easier life somewhere else. But you fought for it because you believed in what it could be." As they reached the porch steps, Thomas stopped and turned to face Sarah, taking both her hands in his. "I have something to ask you," he said, his expression suddenly serious. Sarah raised an eyebrow, waiting. "The Westbrook Foundation has done amazing work these past 5 years," Thomas began. "But I was thinking maybe it's time for a slight rebranding." "Rebranding?" Sarah repeated, confused. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "How does the Westbrook Miller Foundation sound to you?" Sarah's eyes widened as Thomas dropped to one knee, opening the box to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring. "Sarah Westbrook, billionaire philanthropist, and the best damn farmhand I've ever worked with," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. "Will you marry me?" Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she nodded, too overwhelmed to speak for a moment. Finally, she managed to whisper, "Yes, yes, of course I will." As Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, Einstein and Max came bounding around the corner of the house, sensing the excitement in the air. Sarah laughed through her tears, as both dogs nearly knocked them over in their enthusiasm. Later that evening, as they sat by the fireplace in the farmhouse that had been in Thomas's family for generations and would now be part of their shared future, Sarah leaned her head on Thomas's shoulder. "You know," she mused, her engagement ring catching the firelight, "when I started that road trip, I was looking for authenticity, for a connection to what really matters." "And did you find it?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. Sarah smiled. looking up at him with the same vibrantly green eyes that had captivated him from the beginning. Eyes that now held no secrets, no pretense, just love and companionship and the promise of a future built high. Together. "I found so much more," she whispered. "I found home." Outside, the wind rustled through the fields that would lie dormant through the winter before springing to life again in the warm embrace of spring. The cycle of planting and harvest, of struggle and abundance, would continue as it had for generations. But now, the Miller farm, soon to be the Westbrook Miller farm, faced that cycle with renewed strength and purpose, a living testament to what could happen when someone cared enough to help a struggling farmer find his way back to hope. And it had all begun with a lost dog, limping across a withered cornfield on what had seemed like just another hopeless day. But then again, sometimes the most extraordinary changes in our lives come disguised as ordinary moments, if only we have the courage to open our hearts to the possibilities they bring.